Hello, Miss Anderson's class. We're going to continue with the Tiger Rising today. We are on Chapter 8. His father read the note from the principal slowly, putting his big finger under the words as if they were bugs he was trying to keep still. When he was finally done, he laid the letter on the table, rubbed his eyes with his fingers, and sighed. The rain beat a sad rhythm on the roof of the motel. "That stuff ain't nothing anybody can catch," his father said. "I know it," Rob told him. "I already told that to the principal once before. I called up there and told him that." "Yes, sir," said Rob. His father sighed. He stopped rubbing his eyes and looked at Rob. "You want to stay home?" he asked. Rob nodded. His father sighed again. "Maybe I'll make an appointment, get one of them doctors to write down that what you got ain't catching. All right?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. "But I won't do it for a few days. I'll give you some time off." "That would be all right," said Rob. "You got to fight them, you know. Them boys. I know you don't want to, but you got to fight them. Else they won't ever leave you alone." Rob nodded. He saw Sistine twirling and punching and kicking, and the vision made him smile. "In the meantime, you can help me out around here," his father said. "Do some of the maintenance work at the motel. Do some sweeping and cleaning for me. Bew Camp is running me ragged. There ain't enough hours in the day to do everything that man wants done. Now go on and hand me that medicine." His father slathered and slapped the fish-smelling ointment on Rob's legs, and Rob concentrated on holding still. "You think Bew Camp is the richest man in the world?" he asked his father. "Nah," his father said. "He don't own but this one itty-bitty motel now, and the woods. He just likes to pretend he's rich is all." "Why?" "I was just wondering," said Rob. He was thinking about the tiger pacing back and forth in his cage. He was certain that the tiger belonged to Bew Camp. But wouldn't you have to be the richest man in the world to own a tiger? Rob wanted desperately to go see the tiger again, but he was afraid that he had imagined the whole thing. He was afraid that the tiger might have disappeared with the morning mist. "Can I go outside?" Rob asked when his father was done. "Nah," his father said. "I don't want that medicine rained off of you. It costs too much." Rob was relieved, almost, that he had to stay inside. What if he went looking for the tiger, and he was not there? Rob's father cooked them macaroni and cheese for supper on the 2-burner hot plate they kept on the table next to the TV. He boiled the macaroni too long, and a lot of it stuck to the pan, so there wasn't many noodles to go with the powdery cheese. "Someday," he told Rob, "you and me will have a house with a real stove, and I'll do some good cooking then." "This is good," Rob lied. "You eat all you want. I ain't that hungry," his father told him. After supper, his father fell asleep in the recliner, with his head thrown back and his mouth open. He snored, and his feet, big with crooked toes, jerked and trembled. In between the snores, his stomach growled, long and loud, as if he was the hungriest man in the world. Rob sat on his bed and started to work on carving the tiger. He had a good piece of maple, and his knife was sharp, and in his mind he could see the tiger clearly. But something different came out of the wood. It wasn't a tiger at all. It was a person, with a sharp nose and small eyes and skinny legs. It wasn't until he started working on the dress that Rob realized he was carving Sistine. He stopped for a minute, held the wood out in front of him, and shook his head in wonder. It was just like his mother had always said. You could never tell what would come out of the wood. It did what it wanted, and you just followed. He stayed up late working on the carving, and when he finally fell asleep, He dreamed about the tiger, only it wasn't in a cage. It was free and running through the woods, and there was something on its back, but Rob couldn't tell what it was. As the tiger got closer and closer, Rob saw that the thing was Sistine in her pretty pink party dress. She was riding the tiger. In his dream, Rob waved to her and she waved back, but she didn't stop. She and the tiger kept going, past Rob, deeper and deeper into the woods. Chapter 9. His father woke him up at 5:30 the next morning. "Come on, son," he said, shaking Rob's shoulder. "Come on. You're a working man now. You've got to get up." He took his hand away and stood over Rob for a minute, and then he left. Rob heard the door to the motel room squeak open. He opened his eyes. The world was dark. The only light came from the falling Kentucky star. Rob turned over in his bed and pulled back the curtain and looked out the window at the sign. It was like having his own personal shooting star, but he didn't ever make a wish on it. He was afraid that if he started wishing, he might not be able to stop. In his suitcase of non-thoughts, there were also not wishes. He kept the lid closed on them, too. Rob leaned on his elbow and stared at the star and listened to the rain gently drumming its fingers on the roof. There was a warm, glowing kind of feeling in his stomach, a feeling that he wasn't used to. It took a minute to name it. The tiger. The tiger was out there. He got out of his bed, put on his shorts and a t-shirt. "Still hot," his father said when Rob stepped out the door, "and still raining." "Uh-huh," said Rob, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, sir. If it don't stop soon, the whole state ain't gonna be nothing but one big swamp." "The rain doesn't bother me," Rob muttered. On the day of his mother's funeral, it had been so sunshiny that it hurt his eyes. After the funeral, he and his father had to stand outside in the hot, bright light and shake everybody's hand. Some of the ladies hugged Rob, pulling him to them in jerky, desperate movements, smashing his head into their pillowy chests. If you don't look just like her," they told him, rocking him back and forth and holding on to him tight. Or they said, "You got your mama's hair, that cobwebby blonde." And they'd run their fingers through his hair and pat his head like he was a dog. And every time Rob's father extended his hand to somebody, Rob saw the ripped place in his suit, where it split open when he slapped Rob to make him stop crying. And it reminded Rob again, don't cry. Do not cry. That was what the sun made him think of, the funeral. And so he didn't care if he ever saw the sun again. He didn't care if the whole state did turn into a swamp. His father stood up and went back to the motel room and got himself a cup of coffee and brought it back outside. The steam rose off of it and curled in the air. "Now that I'm a working man," Rob said shyly, "could I drink some coffee?" His father smiled at him. "Well," he said, "I guess that'd be all right." Rob went inside and poured himself a mug of coffee and brought it back outside and sat down next to his father, sipping it slowly. It tasted hot, dark, and bitter. He liked it. "All right," his father said after about 10 minutes. "It's time to get to work." He stood up. It wasn't even 6 o'clock. As they walked together along the back of the motel to the maintenance shed, his father started to whistle, "Mining for Gold." It was a sad song he used to sing with Rob's mother. Her high, sweet voice had gone swooping over his father's deep one, like a small bird flying over the solid world. His father must have remembered too, because he stopped halfway through the song, shook his head, and cursed softly under his breath. Rob let his father walk ahead of him. He slowed down and stared into the woods. waiting to see some small part of a tiger, a flick of his tail, or the glow from his eyes. But there was nothing to see except for the darkness and rain. "Come on, son," his father said, his voice hard. Rob hurried to catch up. Chapter 10. Rob was sweeping the laundry room when Willie Mae, the Kentucky Star's housekeeper, came in and threw herself down in one of the metal chairs that were lined up against the cement block wall. "You know what?" she said to Rob. "No, ma'am," said Rob. "I'll tell you what," said Willie Mae. She reached up and adjusted the butterfly clip in her thick black hair. "I'd rather be sweeping up after some pigs in a barn than cleaning up after people in this place. Pigs at least give you some respect." Rob leaned on his broom and stared at Willie Mae. He liked looking at her. Her face was smooth and dark, like a beautiful piece of wood, and Rob liked to think that if he had been the one who carved Willie Mae, he would have made her just the way she was, with her long nose, high cheekbones, and slanted eyes. "What you staring at?" Willie Mae asked. Her eyes narrowed. "What you doing out of school?" Rob shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "What do you mean you don't know?" Rob shrugged again. "Don't be moving your shoulders up and down in front of me, acting like some skinny old bird trying to fly away. You want to end up cleaning motel rooms for a living?" Rob shook his head. "That's right. Ain't nobody want this job. I'm the only fool Bucamp can pay to do it. You got to stay in school," she said, "else you end up like me." She shook her head and reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a single cigarette and 2 sticks of 8-ball licorice gum. She put one piece of gum in her mouth and handed the other to Rob, lit her cigarette, and leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. "Now," she said. The scent of smoke and licorice slowly filled the laundry room. "Go on and tell me why you ain't in school." "On account of my legs being all broke out," said Rob. Willie Mae opened her eyes and looked over the top of her glasses at Rob's legs. She said after a minute. "How long you had that?" "About 6 months," said Rob. "I can tell you how to cure it," said Willie Mae, pointing with her cigarette to his legs. "I can tell you right now. Don't need to go to no doctor." "Huh?" said Rob. He stopped chewing his gum and held his breath. What if Willie Mae healed him, and then he had to go back to school? "Sadness," said Willie Mae, closing her eyes and nodding her head. "You keeping all that sadness down low in your legs. You not letting it get up to your heart where it belongs. You got to let that sadness rise on up." "Oh," said Rob. He let his breath out. He was relieved. Willie Mae was wrong. She couldn't cure him. "The principal thinks it's contagious," he said. "Man ain't got no sense," Willie Mae said. He got lots of certificates," Rob offered. "They're all framed and hung on a wall." "I bet he ain't got no certificate for sense, though," said Willie Mae darkly. She rose up out of her chair and stretched. "I gotta clean some rooms," she said. "You ain't gonna forget what I told you about them legs, are you?" "No, ma'am," said Rob. "What'd I tell you then?" she said, towering over him. Willie Mae was tall, the tallest person Rob had ever seen. "To let the sadness rise," Rob said. He repeated the words as if they were part of a poem. He gave them a certain rhyme, the same way Willie Mae had when she said them. "That's right," said Willie Mae. "You got to let that sadness rise on up." She left the room in a swirl of licorice and smoke. After she was gone, Rob wished that he had told her about the tiger. He felt a sudden desperate need to tell somebody who wouldn't doubt him, somebody who was capable of believing in tigers. Chapter 11. That afternoon, Rob was out in front of the Kentucky Star, weeding between the cracks in the sidewalk, when the school bus rumbled up. "Hey," he heard Norton Three-Monger yelled. Rob didn't look up. He concentrated on the weeds. Hey, disease boy, Norton shouted. We know what you got. It's called leprosy. Yeah, Billy shouted. Leprosy. All of your body parts gonna fall off. They're gonna rot off, Norton yelled. Yeah, Billy screamed. That's what I meant. Rot. They're going to rot off. Rob stared at the sidewalk and imagined the tiger eating Norton and Billy Three-Monger, then spitting out their bones. Hey, Rob shouted. Here comes your girlfriend, disease boy. The bus coughed and sputtered and finally roared away. Rob looked up. Sistine was walking towards him. She was wearing a lime green dress. As she got closer, he could see that it was torn and dirty. I brought you your homework, she said. She held out a 3-ring red notebook stuffed full of papers. The knuckles on her hand were bleeding. Thank you, said Rob. He took the notebook. He was determined to say nothing else to her. He was determined to keep his words inside himself, wherever they belonged. Sistine stared past him at the motel. It was an ugly 2-story building, squat and small, composed entirely of cement block. The doors of each room were painted a different color, pink or blue or green, and there was a chair painted in the matching color sitting in front of each door. Why is this place called the Kentucky Star? Sistine asked. Because, Rob said. It was the shortest answer he could think of. Because why? She asked. Rob sighed. Because Bucamp, the man who owns it, had a horse once called Kentucky Star. Well, said Sistine, it's a stupid name for a hotel in Florida. Rob shrugged. It started to rain. Sistine stood in front of him and continued to stare. She looked at the motel and then over at the blinking Kentucky Star sign, and then she looked back at him as if it was all a math equation that she was trying to make come out right in her head. The rain made her hair stick to her scalp. It made her dress droopy. Rob looked at her small, pinched face and her bleeding knuckles and dark eyes, and he felt something inside him open up. It was the same way he felt when he picked up a piece of wood and started working on it, not knowing what it would be, and then watching it turn into something he recognized. He took a breath, opened his mouth, and let the words fall out. I know where there's a tiger. Sistine stood in the drizzling rain and stared at him, her face blank and fierce. She didn't say, a real one. She didn't say, are you crazy? She didn't say, you're a big old liar. She said one word, where? And Rob knew that he had picked the right person to tell. Chapter 12. We got to walk through the woods, Rob said. He looked doubtfully at Sistine's bright dress and shiny black school shoes. You can give me some of your clothes to wear, she told him. I hate this dress anyways. As he took her to the motel room, and there Sistine stood and stared at the unmade beds and the tattered recliner. Her eyes moved over his father's gun case, and then went to the macaroni pan from the night before, still sitting on the hot plate. She looked at it all the same way she had looked at the Kentucky Star sign, and the motel, and him, like she was trying to add it up in her head. Then she saw his carvings, the little wooden village of odd things that he had made. He had them all on the TV dinner tray beside his bed. Oh, she said, her voice sounding different and lighter. Where did you get these? She went and bent over the tray and studied the carvings, the blue jay, the pine tree, the Kentucky Star sign, and the one that he was particularly proud of, his father's right foot, life-size and accurate, right down to the little toe. She picked them up one by one and then placed them back down carefully. "Where did you get them?" she asked. "I made 'em," said Rob. She didn't doubt him, as some people would have. Instead, she said, "Michelangelo, the man who painted the Sistine ceiling. He sculpted too." "You're a sculptor. You're an artist." "Nah," said Rob. He shook his head. He felt a hot wave of embarrassment and joy roll over him. It lit his rash on fire. He bent and rubbed his hands down his legs, trying to calm them. When he straightened back up, excuse me, he saw Sistine had picked up the carving of her. He had left it lying on his bed, intending to work on it again in the evening. He held his breath as she stared at the piece of wood. It looked so much like her, with her skinny legs and small eyes and defiant stance, that he was certain she would be angry. But, once again, she surprised him. "Oh," she said, her voice full of wonder, "it's perfect. It's like looking in a little wooden mirror." She stared at it a minute more, then carefully laid it back on his bed. "Give me some clothes and we'll go see the tiger." He gave her a pair of pants and a t-shirt and left the room and went outside to wait for her. It was still raining, but not hard. He looked at the falling Kentucky Star sign. He thought for a minute about one of the not wishes he had buried deepest, a friend. He stared at the star and felt the hope and need and fear coursing through him in a hot neon arc. He shook his head. "Nah," he said to the Kentucky Star. "Nah." And then he sighed and stuck his legs out into the rain, hoping to cool them off, hoping to get some small amount of relief. Chapter 13. They walked together through the scrub. The rain had stopped, but the whole world was wet. The pines and the palmettos and the sad clusters of dead orange trees all dripped water. "This is where my mother grew up," Sistine said, swinging her arms wide as she walked. "Right here in Lister. And she said she always told herself that she ever made it out of here, she wasn't going to come back. But now she's back because my father had an affair with his secretary, whose name is Bridget, and who can't type, which is really a bad thing for a secretary not to be able to do. My mother left him when she found out. He's coming down here to see me. Soon, next week probably. I'm going to live with him. I'm not staying here, that's for sure." Rob felt a familiar loneliness rising up and drape its arm over his shoulder. She wasn't staying. There was no point in wishing. The suitcase needed to stay closed. He stared at Sistine's shiny shoes and willed his sadness to go away. "Aren't you worried about messing up your shoes?" he asked. "Nah," she said. "I hate these shoes. I hate every piece of clothing that my mother makes me wear." "Does your mother live with you?" Rob shook his head. "Nah," he said. "Where is she?" He shrugged his shoulders. "My mother's going to open up a store downtown. It's going to be an art store. She's going to bring some culture to this area. She could sell some of your wood sculptures." "They ain't sculptures," Rob protested. "They're just whittling. That's all. And we got to be quiet because Bucamp doesn't want people walking around on his land." "Is this his land?" Sistine asked. "Everything's his," said Rob. "The motel and the woods." "He can't own everything," Sistine argued. "Besides, I don't care. He can catch us. He can put us in jail for trespassing. I don't care. If we're in jail, we won't get to see the tiger." "Where's your mother?" Sistine demanded suddenly. She stopped walking and stared at him. "Shh," said Rob. "You got to be quiet." He kept walking. "I do not have to be quiet," Sistine called after him. "I want to know where your mother is." He turned around and looked at her. Her hands were on her hips. Her black eyes were narrowed. "I don't want to see your stupid tiger," she shouted. "I don't care about it. You don't know how to talk to people. I told you about my father and my mother and Bridget, and you didn't say anything. You won't even tell me about your mother." Keeping her hands on her hips, she turned around and started marching back in the direction of the Kentucky Star. "Keep your stupid secret," she shouted. "Keep your stupid tiger, too. I don't care." Rob watched her because she was wearing his jeans and shirt. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror. It was like watching himself walk away. He shrugged and bent to scratch his legs. He told himself that he didn't care. He told himself that she was leaving soon anyways. And when he looked up and saw her getting smaller and smaller, it reminded him of his dream. He remembered Sistine riding in the woods on the back of the tiger, and suddenly he couldn't bear that thought of watching her disappear again. "Wait up," he shouted, "wait up," and he started to run towards her. She turned and stopped. She waited for him with her hands on her hips. "Well," she said when he got close to her. "She's dead," he told her. The words came out in short, ragged gasps. "My mama's dead." "Okay," said Sistine. She gave a quick, professional nod of her head. She stepped towards him, and Rob turned. Together they walked back in the other direction towards the tiger. Chapter 14. The cage was made out of rusted chain-link fence. There was a wood board that served as a roof, and there was a chain-link door that was locked up tight with 3 padlocks. Inside the cage, the tiger was still pacing back and forth, just as he had been the last time Rob was out, as if he had never stopped pacing, or as if Rob had never gone away. "Oh," said Sistine, in the same voice she had used when she saw Rob's carvings. "He's beautiful." "Don't get too close," Rob ordered. "He might not like it if you stand too close." But the tiger ignored them. He concentrated on pacing. He was so enormous and bright that it was hard to look directly at him. "It's just like that poem says," Sistine breathed. "What?" said Rob. "That poem. The one that goes, 'Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night.' That's the poem. It's just like that. He burns bright." "Oh," said Rob. He nodded. He liked the fierce and beautiful way the words sounded. Just as he was getting ready to ask Sistine to say them again, she whirled around and faced him. "What's he doing way out here?" she demanded. Rob shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "He's Buchamp's, I guess." "Buchamp's what?" said Sistine. "His pet?" "I don't know," said Rob. "I just like looking at him. Maybe Buchamp does too. Maybe he just likes to come here and look at him." "That's selfish," said Sistine. Rob shrugged. "This isn't right for the tiger to be in a cage. It's not right." "We can't do nothing about it," Rob said. "We could let him go," said Sistine. "We could set him free." She put her hands on her hips. It was a gesture that Rob had already come to recognize, and he was wary of it. "We can't," he said. "There's all them locks. We can saw through them." "Nah," said Rob. The mere thought of letting the tiger go made his legs itch like crazy. "We have to set him free," Sistine said, her voice loud and certain. "Nuh-huh. It ain't our tiger to let it go. It's our tiger to save," Sistine said fiercely. The tiger stopped pacing. He pricked his ears back and forth, looking somewhere past Sistine and Rob. "Shh," said Rob. The tiger cocked his head. All 3 of them listened. "It's a car," said Rob. "A car's coming. It's Buchamp. We've got to go. Come on." He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the woods. She ran with him. She let him hold on to her hand. It was an impossibly small and bony hand, as delicate as the skeleton of a baby bird. They ran together, and Rob felt his heart move inside him, not from fear or exhaustion, but from something else. It was as if his soul had grown, and was pushing everything up higher in his body. It was an oddly familiar feeling, but he couldn't remember what it was called. "Is he behind us?" Sistine asked breathlessly. Rob shrugged. It was hard to move his shoulders up and down and keep hold of Sistine's hand at the same time. Sistine stopped. "Stop shrugging your shoulders at me. I hate it. I hate the way you shrug all the time." And that made Rob remember Willie Mae saying that when he shrugged, he looked like a skinny bird trying to fly. It struck him as funny now. He laughed out loud at the thought, and without asking him what he was laughing about, without dropping his hand, without stopping, Sistine laughed too. Then Rob remembered the name of the feeling that was pushing up inside of him, filling him full to overflowing. It was happiness. That's what it was called. Okay, we will start back up here tomorrow.